Welcome to Form and Analysis, the Composer's Perspective. So the way this course works, it's a little bit different from your traditional form and analysis course you might take in college. If you take a form and analysis course in college, it can vary widely in the actual curriculum that you end up addressing. Some universities may have you just analyze a whole bunch of music and learn basic forms like sonata form, rondo form, ternary form, things of that nature. And they tend to neglect some of the deeper insights you can get from understanding why composers chose the forms they used. This is a part of form analysis that is often missing. Why does the ABA ternary form work so well? Why do so many pieces, including popular songs, basically use a form of ABA? Why are so many arias in ABA form? There's a reason for it, and it has a lot to do with repetition and how we understand and comprehend music as humans. So this is something that we're going to get into in this course, and I'm not just going to teach you the concepts, I'm going to show you the why, or at least I'm going to attempt to show you the why. I want to give you the missing piece that's missing for composers who want to better understand how to improve their own compositions, and we're going to talk a lot about this. Now, the way this course works is there is a heavy audiation component. Can you work through this course without audiation? Yes. Do I recommend it? No, because if you cannot audiate what you are hearing and what you are seeing on the page, then you are missing a vital aspect of your training. So it's very important you develop some basic audiation skills. That's going to be really important. So we're also going to start with a harmony review. Now, I don't want you to get too tied up in the exercises and everything that I'm teaching you today. You don't necessarily have to memorize everything right now, because as these concepts come back in actual analysis, when I'm talking about a piece, or when we get into the phrase model and we talk about actual phrases and the different types of phrases that exist, I'm going to review the important aspects of harmony, but I want to provide an introduction to harmony right now at the outset, because you really do need some basic harmony knowledge to be able to truly understand the purpose of form and analysis. So with that being said, this is going to be a fun course. It's going to be very dynamic. We're going to talk about things that you are not going to find elsewhere unless you study privately with an instructor that really knows form and analysis, is a composer, and understands how composers relate their ideas to a given form. There is a composer who I talk about a lot. His name is Arnold Schoenberg, and he talks about the secrets of music composition. Well, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of these sort of inner secrets that are taught by trade. They're taught from teacher to student. And one of these has to do with why composers choose particular forms. It's not enough to simply push your ideas into whatever form meets your timeline. What we want to do is understand why this particular motive is more suited to a binary form, a ternary form, sonata, rondo, concerto. We want to understand and we want to determine if there are reasons for choosing particular motives at particular moments in a composition. So that is what this course is going to teach you. It's going to teach you the forms. You're definitely going to learn forms. It's going to teach it through composition. So you will try to create your own compositions based on the information in the lectures. So when we get to, for example, a type of phrase, which is basically a melody that we call the period, you'll be composing a period. And what you can do is you can try and do this on your own, because this is a self-study course, or you can take this to a private instructor and say, hey, I'm trying to compose a period, through the lens of Kaplan. It's one of the books that I'm going to recommend that you secure at some point, and try and find an instructor that will actually help you with that. But I'm going to give you all the information so that you can do this on your own. So I just want to be clear about that. You're not left alone. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you understand the concept of each type of phrase so that you can go and actually compose these on your own. So let's get started with this. Here are some of the materials that I would recommend you check out for additional information. The William Kaplan book, Analyzing Classical Form. He has one called Classical Form as well, but the Analyzing Classical Form is much clearer to read. It's easier to understand. It's actually a later book that he wrote based on his classical form text, and so I think while both of them are still available, the Analyzing Classical Form was his second attempt at it, and it became much, much clearer. So definitely look for that one. It's a great book because Kaplan is somebody that really talks about some phrases that you might not have heard about before, such as hybrid themes. And so we're going to get into all that. But one of the problems with his book and with any book on music theory, and one of the reasons I'm recommending his book as supplementary materials, is because this course, I'm going to try and make it simple. I'm not going to throw hundreds of pieces at you that will end up you'll forget them. Often when we study theory, we analyze all these different pieces and we don't actually learn those pieces. The idea behind it is that if I introduce you to Beethoven, Brahms, Mozart, Schoenberg, Ligeti, Sibelius, all these different composers, you're getting a much broader view of music, and that's true. But it makes it more difficult for a composer who is going to write their own music anyway. It makes it difficult for them to learn the concepts. Here's an example. If I were to play a piece in major, and then I tell you, so major sounds happy, can you hear that? And then I say, now here's another piece, it's in minor. Minor sounds sad, can you hear that? You'll hear it, but I think it's a better comparison if you use the same piece. If you take the major piece, you play it in major, and then you show them what it sounds like in minor. So that's what I'm doing. In this course, I will be taking an excerpt, mostly from Haydn, and I will be showing you how all these different phrases, using the same basic motivic material from this one piece by Haydn, you can modify it to turn into all these different types of phrases. And then you have a comparison. It makes it easier to see what the actual differences are in a piece. So that's one of the things that's going to make my method a little different. So just to show you this, if I play you a famous tune, Frere Jacques. And then I tell you, that is what major sounds like. You can say, okay, I kind of hear a bright quality to it. You can kind of get an understanding. If I then say minor sounds different, it sounds somewhat sadder. Comparing the same idea being modified to fit the definition of major or minor, comparing them side by side, I feel is a much better way of explaining concepts. But that being said, there is a great benefit to using outside works as well and hearing a multiple of different works from different composers. That is musical literacy. But I'm not so interested in musical literacy for this course. I'm more interested in helping you understand why certain forms work for certain motives, and you'll see how this kind of progresses as the course continues. But for those of you who want additional materials, I know some people are going to complain there's not enough examples. I'm giving you the examples that you need to understand a concept that you are then going to go out and compose on your own. But if you want more information, the William Kaplan is a great book. It has tons of different musical examples. Arnold Schoenberg, The Fundamentals of Music Composition. It also shows a lot of different types of phrases, and it provides you with tons of musical examples as well. So I'm giving you some additional resources that you can look for. The Arnold Schoenberg book is easily found in a lot of places. You can even find it in the public domain. And I'm also going to give you plenty of instruction in this course so that you know exactly what you need to do for each lesson. So make sure you download the PDF lessons ahead of time. That's going to be important. You'll download the PDFs and then watch this video. All right, so let's move right along then. All right, so we're going to deal with harmony today. Harmony is really important. I don't expect you to understand harmony. You should have an idea of what key signatures are. You should really know your major and minor key signatures before taking this course. You should know how to build triads, chords, things like that. I'm not going to be teaching you that in this course. There are other courses that I offer that do address that, and there's plenty of free resources online that you can look up as well. But what we're going to focus on is sort of undergraduate harmony, which is coming with the expectation that you know what a major scale is, a minor scale it is, the 4 types of triads, and the 7th chords that are used in music. Everything else I'm going to teach you in a crash course style. And I'm going to show you how these techniques are actually used in music rather than doing exercises where I make you write out dominant to tonic progressions, secondary dominant chords, augmented 6th chords, things like this. There's not going to be a lot of busy work in here. It's either going to be real analysis or you composing music. Okay? And the other thing I will just say is sometimes I will give you analysis assignments. And so what you will do is go ahead and you go home. You're already at home, I assume. But you go home and you try and complete the assignment on your own. Before you come to the next lesson, make sure you complete it because we are going to review the answers. And then you can check your work and I'll explain the process for why some of these answers are the way they are to give you as much information as possible so that you can grasp and understand these concepts. So we're going to learn theory by doing it. Okay? So let's get into harmony review. One of the most important things when it comes to form and analysis is something known as an authentic cadence. It is incredibly important. So if you're in the key of C major and you play a C major chord, this is a C major chord, we call that the tonic. It's the first scale degree of a C major scale if you build a triad on it. So that's the note C, E, and G. If you then go to scale degree 5, G, B, and D, and you play that, you end up with a dominant triad. So scale degree 1 is tonic, scale degree 5 is dominant. And what we have here are we have these authentic cadences. They move from 5 to 1. So an authentic cadence moves from 5 to 1. But we have different types of authentic cadences. There is a perfect authentic cadence, an imperfect authentic cadence, and this is not really necessary, but some people further distinguish imperfect authentic cadences by calling them contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadences. So you could say there are 3 types of authentic cadences. But keep in mind, we're going to explain this, the contrapuntal is a type of imperfect. That's why we call it contrapuntal imperfect authentic cadence. Not all theorists are going to differentiate between an imperfect and a contrapuntal, because essentially they're both not perfect. And what we care about when it comes to authentic cadences is we have cadences that are perfect and we have cadences that are imperfect. That's what matters. And a perfect authentic cadence has to follow a very strict set of rules. Otherwise, it's not considered perfect. Now, why is a perfect authentic cadence considered perfect? We will try and address that a little bit later. But for now, what you need to know is that when we look at a perfect authentic cadence, we're trying to build it, we have the bass note is scale degree 5. So these are all in C major that you see on the screen. This is G. That's here's C, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5th scale degree is G. So we put that in the bass and we build a G major triad on it. So G, B, and D. Now you'll notice the root is doubled. In fact, in this progression, the root is doubled here as well. Let's go on to the next one. There's a G, another G, so the root of the chord is doubled. You should know what a root is. And then B and D. The C, it's doubled, E and G. Here we go, G, doubled again, B and D. The root is doubled here, C and C, E and G. Here we have a G, doubled, B and D. Here we have a C, another C, an E, and a G. Go to the next one, G, G, B, and D. Here we have another C, C, E, and G. So I just went through each one of these possible voicings to illustrate something. When you have an authentic cadence, in most cases, there are exceptions, of course, there's always exceptions, but in most cases, you're going to double the root of the chord because we want to make the root of the chord the strongest note. So one way to do that is to double its have more than one person playing the part, more than one voice, more than one instrument. So let's go look at this last one. Here's the root of the chord. It's a G, but it's in first inversion, so we put the third in the bass. So we have a G and another G. Again, we have doubled the root of the chord, then we have a B and a D. So here's C, C, E, and G. So I hope that what this did for you is you learned that in authentic cadences, in their sort of perfect format, and these are what we call paradigms, they're taken out of the music to show you how things are done. So it's just kind of a template for how you can do it, but actually in music, composers get really creative with how these are actually voiced. But these are paradigms that show you exactly how to voice authentic cadences. So when you're writing authentic cadences, if you want to make it strong, you make sure you double that root. That's really important for both the 5 and the 1 chord. The next thing you want to do is deal with tendency tones. So these are all triads. There are no 7th chords here, which means there's only one tendency tone. A tendency tone is something that has a tendency to want to move. If I play a C major scale, if I stop there, it doesn't necessarily need to move. We go up to the 4th scale degree, maybe a little bit of friction, but not that strong. That sounds really stable. If anything, this scale degree 5 wants to come back to 1. Scale degree 6, I don't know necessarily where it wants to go. It could go up, it could go down. Now this one has a pole. This is a 7th scale degree and it wants to go up. So because of that, the 7th scale degree is a tendency tone when you have a key center. So when a piece is based on C major and we have a B in it, we want it to resolve up. So because of that, we call it a tendency tone. So in all of these examples, one thing that you should do is resolve the leading tone. And I will tell you, there are instances where the leading tone doesn't resolve. But those are again exceptions, and we'll talk about those later. So notice, I put a slur here. B to C. That's a leading tone going to the tonic. B to C, leading tone tonic. B to C, leading tone tonic. Leading tone tonic. Leading tone tonic. Leading tone tonic in the bass. So what makes something perfect? You'll notice that here, a perfect authentic cadence, it has only one possible solution. There's actually two. This measure and this measure, measure 5 and 6. In order for it to be authentic and perfect, it needs to have 5-1 root motion, and then we need the leading tone to resolve to the tonic. So in both these measures, that's exactly what happens. The leading tone resolves to the tonic, we have 5-1 in the bass. Look at all the others. Here we have a G in the soprano. Now I'll tell you that in the classical period, actually, it's very rare, and some would say it shouldn't happen. An imperfect authentic cadence usually does not resolve with 5 in the soprano. It's usually scale degree 3, like we see in measure 8. This is scale degree 3. We go C, D, E, we get to the 3rd scale degree. So this is actually a resolution that is kind of your imperfect authentic cadence, the most typical one. This one here goes from D to E. That E is again the 3rd scale degree, so it's a pretty typical resolution. But notice what the bass is doing. 5-1, 5-1, 5-1. So all the imperfect authentic cadences will resolve to something other than scale degree 1. Now I'm going to make this simple for you in a minute. Contrapuntal, what makes a contrapuntal? We just need stepwise motion in the bass. Contrapuntal means stepwise. If you've taken a counterpoint course, you'll know that. So contrapuntal cadences tend to be stepwise. This is a contrapuntal cadence solely because of what happens in the bass. It doesn't matter that it ends on scale degree 1. That doesn't make it perfect because we don't have 5-1 in the bass here. So this contrapuntal resolution in the bass is really important. So a simple way to think about this, there are voice leading guidelines. You want to try and move the shortest distance possible. So if we look at this first chord, the G, 5th scale degree, it stays the same because the G is common between the 5 chord and the 1. So in the 5 chord, you got the notes G, B, and D. And then the 1 chord, you have C, E, G. So that G is a common tone between both the C major chord and the G major chord. So we can keep it in the same voice. And we want to keep it in the same voice. And then you move the remaining voices by step. So you've got the leading tone, the tendency tone has to go up. You have to have 5-1 in the bass. So that's 2 voices taken care of. You need to have a common tone. So you put it in one of the voices. It can either be here in measure 5, or you can put it down here in what we call the tenor in measure 6. And then the other 2 voices, they just move by step. And you want to make sure that you have complete chords. You want to have a G, a B, and a D, and a C, E, and a G. That's how you make a perfect authentic cadence. And that's how you do voice leading for all of these progressions. So one thing that I want to point out, the trick to make sure you're dealing with a perfect authentic cadence is you should always end on scale degree 1 in the soprano, and you should have 5-1 root motion in the bass. And then it's assumed that you're dealing with a 5 chord and a 1 chord, dominant and tonic. And as long as you have those 3 things, you have a perfect authentic cadence. If you have an authentic cadence, which is simply 5 moving to 1, and it does anything other than that, it's either imperfect, or if you want to get really particular, contrapuntal. That's it. So again, the perfect authentic cadence resolves to 1 by step in the soprano, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. So soprano resolves by step. The bass has 5-1 motion. As long as you have a complete triad, it's perfect, as long as you have those criteria. So we're going to see these a lot, but it's really important to know the difference between a perfect and an imperfect authentic cadence. But I'm going to review this, not in this much detail, but I'm going to explain this every single time we have a perfect authentic cadence until we reach a point where you should know what these are. And if this isn't a good enough explanation, then there are some additional resources you can find for free that will teach you what a perfect authentic cadence is. But theory is not completely part of form. I'm going to teach it as much as I can, but if you still don't understand it, you'll want to understand this basic concept. Authentic cadences are very important for understanding form. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and go on to the next topic. One thing you should try and do, which if you take an audiation course, you should learn to audiate all of these cadences. You should learn what they sound like. So you can start by kind of hearing the bass. We're dealing with measure 5 right now. And then maybe you add the tenor. And you can separate them like this. Until eventually you play them together. And then you audiate that. And you try and hear both voices clearly. Take your time. Enjoy it because you'll be more effective if you do this. So then you add the alto, the G. And maybe you arpeggiate it. Then you audiate. Then you audiate. And then you go on to the next chord, the 1 chord. You have to break them apart, you do that. You do whatever you need to do to start to hear these. So here's your 5 chord again. And then it just resolves. And then you go ahead and you add the top voice. You just listen to that. You try and hear it internally, and then you resolve it. And then you do it again. You play it, and then you listen. So this is why piano skills are important. There is a debate on whether or not people should be required to learn piano, but it's one of the best tools available, and pianos are now so cheap that even an inexpensive keyboard will allow you to hear multiple voices. And so you want to just take your time using a hunt and peck technique to try and hear these chords, try and audiate them. And what you can do is, if you can't play the piano, maybe you can play one line. So you play the soprano. You audiate that. And then you play the soprano again. And then you play the alto. So while you're playing the alto, try and hear the soprano. I'm singing, but that's what you're audiating. So then you try and hear both of them together. You audiate that, and then you add another voice. And you keep going until you can do all the voices. So it's a good idea to get these sounds in your head. That's what the audiation courses teach you. But in the absence of that, if you can learn to play piano, or you already play piano, you can play these and try and audiate them on your own. So what is the purpose of an authentic cadence? If we take this cadence, let's listen to that. Those two chords alone sound final. It sounds like something's come to a close, even with just those two chords, because we have that strong B, the leading tone resolving up, and we have this voice leading that creates tension and then resolution. So authentic cadences are used to close ideas, to put a period at the end of the sentence. They definitively end an idea, or in our case, a melody. So they're really important for music for that reason. So we're going to talk about another type of cadence now. A half cadence. A half cadence is kind of like a comma. When you have a comma in a sentence, you have to go on. You can't end a sentence with a comma. It feels inconclusive. So if we look at measure 12, we have this C in the bass, then we have another C, a G, and an E all the way up here. So that right there, that is your established chord for the key. That is your one chord, your tonic. And it is re-emphasized by the fact that the root is doubled. So if we bring it in to a 5 chord, so we're basically doing the reverse of an authentic cadence. Instead of going from 5 to 1, we're now going from 1 out to 5. It ends up creating this sound that feels like it's not ready to be finished yet. It's a comma in a sentence. You can think of it that way. Play it together. If I end the piece there, you're like, okay, hold on, where's the rest of the music? You can hear that. So a half cadence, what it does is it creates this need to continue. And so half cadences are really important so that your melody, which depending on the chord progression that's underneath it, could sound like it ends, or it could sound like it needs to continue. If you've ever been writing a piece and you got to maybe the 4th or the 8th measure, and you suddenly realize, well, it sounds like my piece ended. I don't know how to make it continue. The majority of the time it's because you didn't put any tension at the end of the phrase. You did not signal to the audience that, hey, I'm not done yet. This is a brief resting point. That's what a comma does. It's a brief rest. But I've got more to say. And it creates tension because we wait for what happens after that comma in music. We want to hear what's going to happen next. So we wait for it. So a half cadence, what it does is it creates this sense of tension. It's inconclusive. So I'm showing you a bunch of 1 chords going to 5. You could have a 1-6 or a 1 in root position. But a half cadence truly moves from any chord to a 5 chord. So you could have a 2 to a 5. That's a half cadence, scale degree 2. Going from D minor here to G major, that would be a half cadence. You could go from 4 to 5. That is still a half cadence because it ends on 5. You could even do something like this, a 5 of 5, if you know what a secondary dominant is. That is also a half cadence. So a half cadence is anything that ends on 5. And all these cadences, they have to end with particular portions of a phrase. So for simplicity purpose right now, I'm going to explain this later when we get into phrases in more detail, but to make it simple right now, your cadence comes at the end of a phrase. So if you have a melody that goes for 8 bars, let's just take Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. We would expect to hear a 5-1 cadence at the end of this phrase in order to believe that it was finished. If we go from 1 to 5 at the end of that phrase, then it feels like we have to keep going. So half cadences are really important. They don't really have any particular voice leading, although they tend to do the reverse of what an authentic cadence does. So remember, an authentic cadence, the leading tone resolves up. So here's your B in the key of C. That's the leading tone. It should go up to C. Well, the half cadence kind of reverses it. The C comes down to the B. So you'll see that in all these. C comes down to the B. Here, and with half cadences, voice leading is looser, but we still have a C going down to a B. It's still kind of moving by step. And then here's C to B. So that is one way to think of a half cadence. If you reverse the leading tone tonic relationship, then you can write a pretty smooth half cadence. Do all half cadences have to resolve to the leading tone from the tonic? So going from the tonic here, the C, to the B? No. The only thing that matters, is that you end on a 5 chord. But what I was going to say here is, if you have the C coming down to the B, the C is not a tendency tone. Only the B is. So if you move from the 5 to another chord, then yes, the B has to move up. But we could technically approach this from a G going to a B, and then there's no reverse resolution of the tonic going to the leading tone. So the important thing to remember about half cadences, they're inconclusive. They kind of act like a period in a sentence, and they give the impression they have to move forward. They have to keep going. So you should know what a 6/4 chord is. The cadential 6/4 is a particular type of 6/4 chord. And one of the things you should understand about 6/4 chords, this is a 6/4 chord. It has this need to resolve down. That's when it sounds complete. It sounds like it's come back to its starting point. So 6/4 chords, some theorists will actually say they don't exist. They're just suspensions. They do exist. They just don't function like the chord that you think they are. So here, we have a 5/6/4. So what this really is, in the key of C, we have the notes C, E, and G. So that is a 1/6/4 chord, but we're labeling it as a 5/6/4. Why? Because with this G in the bass and this strong need to kind of resolve down, I'm going to play this for you. You have this chord right here. This strong need, you can hear it, how it wants to come into a root position chord. What we say is that actually the goal of this progression here, the 5/6/4 to 5/3, which is just a root position 5 chord, is actually the 5 chord. So because this is emphasizing what we call a dominant harmony, what we say is that this is not a 6/4, it's not a 1/6/4, it's a dominant harmony that is being suspended. So in a sense, the C and the E are actually non-chord tones that are resolving into the chord tones of G major. So kind of an important concept, and it's changed over the years because we used to write a cadential 6/4 as a 1/6/4, and you'll see that in some older textbooks. But now we have a new interpretation of it, which is that the 1/6/4 is not a 6/4 chord, it's not a 1 chord, it's actually just a dominant suspension with the E and the C not being resolved. Now I know if you understand what a suspension is, you're saying, but the suspension's not being prepared, so it's not a true suspension, and that's true. But I'm using the word suspension in the kind of in the way that the actual chord tones are not being revealed until after these notes that have been suspended. So it's kind of complicated, but a lot of theorists will actually use the terminology that a 1/6/4 is sort of like a suspended harmony with the E and the C not belonging to the chord, and they're just waiting to resolve down to the harmony in the chord. So if we play this first progression, you've got your C, G, E, and C. So the first chord, the tonic chord, that establishes the key. And then when we go to the 2 chord, that creates tension. You can just feel that tension. It really wants to move somewhere. And where does it want to move? In this case, to an even more tense chord. And then it resolves to the 5 chord. And then finally, we come back to the tonic having a complete resolution. So if you play that, we end up having this complete chord progression where the tonic chord establishes a key, the 2 chord pushes it forward, the predominant, the 5 chord creates a dominant suspension, which eventually resolves to a dominant, and then in many cases we'll come back to a 1, or we could stay there on the dominant and it becomes a half cadence. So what we have written here where it goes back to the 1, that's a perfect authentic cadence. This, if we ended here, would be a half cadence. So notice here's a 2/6 chord, here's a 4 chord. So the 4 chord, if you happen to use a 4 chord, then it does work more like a suspension because the C is held over. But you'll notice this E, it's acting like a passing tone. So that's why I'm not thrilled about saying a 1/6/4 chord is a suspended dominant, because I get the point. If we have a 1, or if this is a F/6/4 chord, but if we have a 6/4 chord, it feels like it wants to come down. Yeah, I get that. But it doesn't really feel like a true suspension unless it is held over from the previous bar from a consonant chord. And those of you that know about suspensions and have already taken counterpoint, you'll understand this. So just think of these top notes as a 6 above the 5 and a 4th above the 5. That's really what this is showing you. So this is scale degree 5. That's where the number 5 comes from. And then you've got G, A, B, C, D, E. That's 6 notes above the G. That's where your 6 comes from. So here's your 6 going to a 5 above the G. The 4 shows you a 4th above. It's actually an 11th, but it's a compound 4th. So here you got G to C, that's your 4th, and it comes down to a 3rd above the bass. So that's where these numbers come from. We see this a lot in music theory. It's voice leading. It is showing you voice leading. So if you see a 5/6/4, it's really telling you there should be a 6 above the bass and a 4th above the bass. And if you see it in this particular format, where the 5/6/4 actually forms a 1 chord in second inversion, it's what we call a cadential 6/4. So you're going to see this a lot, and you should get used to the sound of the 1/6/4. Because you'll hear it in music. It's very common. Another type of 6/4 chord is the pedal 6/4. So this first one, you can see how the first chord establishes stability. Second chord, the 6/4, creates instability. And then the final one resolves it. So your pedal 6/4 uses 2 types of motion. You've got a pedal tone, and all of these, here's a pedal, the G and the G, these are all pedal. Pedals stay the same and they create dissonance with the notes above them. So the other aspect of it that we have is neighbor motion. So we go up and we come down. So we're using neighbor tones and pedal motion to create the pedal 6/4. So generally there's 3 requirements. The dissonance needs to be created with an unstable chord on a weak beat. So here, check. 4/6/4, the F and the A are considered dissonant. Think of a 6/4 chord as a dissonant chord. Here, same thing. Weak beat, weak beat, weak beat. So these all have the 6/4 and a weak beat. You need to also have a pedal tone. It almost always occurs in the bass, otherwise it's not really a 6/4 chord. If it doesn't have the pedal in the bass, then we would just call it a neighboring chord. So there's a slight difference there, okay? And I have a bullet point about that here. When neighboring and pedal motion occur, but a 6/4 is not created, the progression may be referred to as a neighboring chord. So I like this one because it's really easy. You build your one chord, you copy it to the end of the phrase, and then you just find your common tone between the 1, the 4/6/4, and the 1 in this case, and then you use neighboring motion. If you start in a 5 chord, it results in a 5/1/6/4 5. So what this does is now we've had the cadential 6/4 and the pedal 6/4. These 2 types of 6/4 chords, and there's 2 more we got to talk about, they detail how 6/4 chords are used in music most commonly. We'll see exceptions to this, and we'll deal with that when it comes, but we're going to teach you the most common way these chords are used first. So as you can see, you can go from a 1 to a 4, a 5 to a 1. As long as you create a 6/4 chord and start on a stable triad, then you can create a pedal 6/4. All you do is you have to have pedal tones throughout and neighboring motion. So let's talk about the next type of non-6/4 chord. Arpeggiating 6/4, no voice leading, because you are literally just going from a 4 to a 4/6/4 to a 4/6. They're all the same chord. There's no tendency tones. You can't have direct motion into an octave. It doesn't occur. It's all the same chord. So you can do whatever you want. But the idea here is that you want to move from a 4 to an inverted chord and then eventually arrive at the 6/4. So wherever you see the 6/4 chord in the progression, that's where if you were analyzing it, you might write under it in parentheses ARP 6/4. Notice in the final example here, this 5/6/4 comes at the end. So I write ARP 6/4 here because the 6/4 chord is the goal of the progression. And remember, it creates tension. Now, 6/4 chords are really great for opening up or closing textures because you're just arpeggiating between the same chord. You can't make any voice leading, and they're pretty easy to perform for that reason. You can kind of keep the balance the same. The other thing I'll say is that when you're dealing with arpeggiations or the same chord that's repeated throughout the measure, as long as you firmly establish what the chord is on the first beat, you could actually be missing the third on beat 2, beat 3, or beat 4. Because we've already established what the chord is, the ear pretty quickly fills in the quality because it's already been acquainted with it. So arpeggiating 6/4, a very easy one. It doesn't use any special voice leading. You really can't make any mistakes. There's no special doublings. Typically you try and double the root still, but even that is not an exact requirement. The next one is the passing 6/4. So we've dealt with the cadential. We've dealt with the pedal or neighboring. It could be called either thing. We've dealt with the arpeggiating, and now we have the passing 6/4. So what the passing 6/4 does is you have a 1 chord, a non-chord tone here, and it just passes through to the first inversion of the chord. You can also start with a 1/6 and go to a root position chord. Again, this is just a passing tone on its way to get between the root and the third of the chord. You could start on any chord. Here's a 4/6, it goes to 4, 1/6 goes to 1. So what happens is a few different things. Typically, there's some instances where this doesn't happen, but a passing 6/4 has something known as a voice exchange. So this C exchanges with this C here, and this E exchanges with this E here. That's called a voice exchange. When 2 voices, and they have to be the same voices. So in this case, bass and tenor, they switch parts in a way. It's off by an octave, but they're effectively switching notes. So watch that again. The C goes to here, the E goes to here. So let's find it here. We have an E going down to a C. So the E here switches with the E up here. The C here switches with the C down here. Voice exchange. Here, F to F, and then, sorry, that's an A, so I actually found the wrong one. Okay, so the voice exchange is actually here. A to A, and then F to F. Another voice exchange. So here's E to E, and C to C, a voice exchange. So as long as you have a common tone, common tone, common tone, common tone, common tone, a voice exchange, boom, 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 and then doon, doon, and here, and then you just have some neighboring motion in the other voice, you end up with a passing 6/4, and the bass, of course, fills in the non-chord tone. So they're pretty easy to create. You kind of create a voice exchange first. You decide where do I want to go from, 1 to 1/6, or 1/6 to 1, or 4 to 4/6, or 4/6 to 1. You put in the passing tone on the bass. You create a voice exchange. Find the common tone between all three chords. Add some neighboring motion, and you are done. So the passing 6/4 used a lot. It's just kind of a fun way to expand the tonic, because here we're effectively just expanding the one chord without being boring and just going. We go from a 1 to a 4, or in this case a 5/6/4, and then back to a 1. And we make sure we have this strong voice leading that helps to resolve that secondary chord. Okay, so this was a crash course really in 6/4 chords today and authentic cadences. So we learned about authentic, half, and the 4 types of 6/4 chords. So what I'd like you to do is watch this, take some notes, and make sure you understand these concepts today. Now, I don't care if you can resolve your chords properly. I don't care if you're resolving your 7s properly and things like that. That is more of a harmony course. We're less concerned with that because it's more about analysis in this course. But it would be helpful if you understood that there's different types of authentic cadences. There's perfect, imperfect, and contrapuntal. There are half cadences that are inconclusive. They act like a sentence. And then we have the 4 types of 6/4 chords, where you've got the cadential 6/4 is the first one. I was trying to remember the order. Cadential 6/4 is the first one I talked about. And then I went on to the pedal or the neighboring. 2 terms, same thing. You can call it pedal or neighboring 6/4 chord. And then we had the arpeggiating followed by the passing 6/4 chord. So have a general understanding of what those terms are. Don't worry too much. Don't waste too much time on this. Just come back in a day or two and go on to the next lesson once you feel comfortable with those basic concepts. It doesn't have to be perfect because you're going to do so much analysis. You're going to learn what these chords are. You're going to start to hear them. You're going to start to see them a lot. And eventually you will be composing with them. And that's what the chord progression sheet is for, because it actually tells you how to do the voice leading for all of these various chord progressions. So I'm looking forward to seeing you again. Don't get overwhelmed. Spend a day or two on this. Let the information soak in. If it didn't fully soak in today, watch this lecture again tomorrow. Open up that chord progression sheet that I gave you and just kind of look at the voicings, look at the instructions I give you for resolving those, and just have a general idea. It doesn't need to be perfect yet, and then come back and we'll continue this discussion of harmony. Remember, this is a crash course in harmony. I'm really teaching a year of harmony in 3 sessions, so it's a lot. So don't feel bad if you're overwhelmed or don't really understand this stuff. You'll pick it up as we go.